Welcome back. In this tutorial we will look at melee weapons. Melee weapons have a very precise structure. You have the usual ID and UI. You have a general tab which shows information. You have a throwable tab that shows whether the item can be thrown, the weapon can be thrown or not. You have a weapon tab with a number of information such as if it's two-handed, if it's a main weapon, if it's a paired weapon, if it's default on the right hand, the reach, and a bunch of other information. There's a list of executions and finishes. We'll go into detail on this in a later tutorial. Whether the weapon allows backstabbing, which is basically an attack that you do from behind and that can deal extra damage. You have the model tab, which basically gives you the option of what do you draw, if you want to use a holster or not, and the information on the holster. Where does the weapon spawn? And you can see there's mention of right hand, left hand, the sound you make when you draw and sheath the weapon, and a list of actions. Actions are basically things you can do with a weapon with the item in your hand. You can trigger attacks, parries, but you could also have actions that trigger abilities, actions that trigger spell. The mechanism is generic. It's basically a way to link 6 inputs to 6 different things you can do when you have an item in your hand. And bear in mind that if you are unarmed, you still have an item in your hand, which is the fact that you are unarmed. Now, in this tutorial we will look at the model prefab for a sword. The model prefab for a sword has a number of components. There's a weapon hook component, there's an audio source which is used to play sound with a weapon, you have the actual model, and you have a damage collider which has a trigger. This gets set to trigger at runtime, and a camera shake trigger. The key component that identifies a weapon is the weapon hook. This is the component that links parts of the weapon to the global system and the controller. Here you can have the target for the offhand IK if a weapon is two-handed. You can have a projectile display, you can have a raycast origin for shooting, you can have hit effects, muzzle flash, these are for shooting weapons. You can specify the audio source if you don't want to use the one on the same level. You can specify a weapon trail, you can specify a weapon VFX. This will be handled by the weapon action. If this is, for example, a bow, you can have a name, release, and reload trigger for an animator placed on the level. You have events for when the weapon is initted, drawn, sheathed. And this is also the component that will link the weapon damage collider with the rest of the system. Damage collider are hitboxes that you have on a weapon. They are they need a collider which is set to trigger at start and gets activated when the weapon action tells the weapon hook to activate damage collider because you are triggering an attack. we go into more detail on that. You can have multiple weapon damage colliders on a weapon. If your weapon, let's find a simple example. In this weapon pack, in this animation pack, there's a weapon which is an animated whip. Let's pause it here. And this whip has multiple bones, and you can add multiple damage colliders so that when the weapon animates, every single bone has a weapon collider, as a damage collider, and they all get activated at the same time, and they follow the animation. Or you can also use this mechanism for a tail of monster, where you have multiple bones, and you can have one damage collider per bone, and they all get animated. The weapon hook will collect all the colliders at start, and will disable all the triggers at runtime when the weapon action triggers them. Going back to the sword, going back to the sword item, Eadon character controller does not have inherent restriction on what can be placed into which hand. The sword is a weapon, and this weapon is considered a main weapon and as default on the right hand. But as you can see here, there's a right hand offset and a left hand offset. Offset are basically how you place animation attached to a bone. And if you go into play mode, you can place the sword in the right hand and trigger an attack. Then you can go back to the inventory, and you can place the sword in the left hand, and you can trigger an attack, which is the same animation. The system is smart enough to determine that the animation needs to be mirrored dynamically because you're using it on a different hand, and this is tied to this flag here, default on right hand, which basically means, hey, I'm a weapon, all my animation are made assuming I am on the right hand, so if you keep it on the left hand, that's not the default hand, so the animation gets mirrored. Same principle if you use a shield. The shield could be meant to use the left hand. You might have shield for the animation for the shield, for example for a parry, which uses the left hand, and if you untick this for the shield, as you can see, and you keep the shield on the right hand, then the animation will be mirrored. This is how you handle the fact that you have animation made for one hand and you still can keep on the other hand. At the same time, you can restrict the weapon. For example, you can say, hey, this shield, I only want it on the left hand, and your shield will not be equipable on the right hand. Vice versa, you can say only on the right hand, and it will not be equipable on the left hand. By default, items can be equipped on any hand you want. You also have the option, let's go back to the sword, you have the option of say, hey, this is a paired weapon, which of course requires you to have animation for that. And when you go into play mode, and you keep the weapon in the right hand, you end up with two weapons, one per hand. Of course, this requires an animation with multiple hands, and because if I trigger an attack now, the attack is on with the right hand and the left hand doesn't do anything. But this, if you have animations for dual blade combat like double daggers or double swords, that's how you can use this effectively. Weapons have a reach, which is used by the AI system, and basically it's given this weapon, given my default animation, how far do I need to be from my target in order to be able to hit it when I trigger the animation. Weapons have idle animation overrides, which are basically animation that get played here in the left hand and right hand. These are layers that are masked to only display the arm, and they override the idle animation basically to have a pose that handles the weapon in the correct position. So your shield might be more in front of you or more on the side, but correctly positioned as opposed to the default idle animation. Then you have the damage. The damage is the same mechanism for all damage in Eadon character controller. You have instant damage. This is of type physical damage, but you could have multiple types of damage. You have value. You have a max value. If max value is greater than value, then the damage will actually be randomized. You have a chance of critical damage that goes from 0 to 1. 0 means 0 and 1 is 100%. And if you deal critical damage, because let's say you put 10% chance of critical damage, if you do critical damage, then you deal double the damage. We'll get to this scale with difficulty later when we get to the combat tutorial. Then you can have damage over time. And for example, this particular weapon could cause bleeding. And bleeding is basically one point of damage for 10 seconds every second. And actually this is instant damage, this is the damage over time. Yeah. So this weapon on a hit will deal 10 points of damage and then will cause bleeding of 1 per second for 10 seconds. You can have quarter second, half second, whole second, 2 seconds frequency. Damage can, for example, also be with RF effect, and you can specify the radius, and you can specify which layers and tags can be damaged in an area of effect. For example, you can say not the player, but deal damage to enemies. And only if they have the tag boss. Then weapon have durability. If durability is greater than 1, then the weapon might break with use. And when it breaks, you can play a sound and you can spawn a VFX. When you spawn a weapon, we'll go into more detail on this in a specific tutorial. Weapon will spawn attached to a bone, and you can have a single offset, which in this offset is basically position and rotation, or you can have, if you want to use the same weapon on multiple characters, you can have multiple spawn options, which are basically character name and the position offset and the scale. The character name is this. That's how you identify that that particular character has that particular weapon offset. This is useful, for example, if you have multiple characters and you want to use the same sword, but the player is this size and with bones oriented in a certain way, and the other character might be a skeleton which might be slightly smaller with smaller bones and different rotation, and you want to use the same weapon on both, so you set up spawn options per character. The next tutorial will go into detail on how to create spawn offset for a specific weapon. The last part of this tutorial is how you create a melee weapon. Creating a melee weapon is very simple. You go to create melee weapon, and let's find a weapon like, for example, the axe of the barbarian. We can call this axe. Then you have two checkboxes: create the weapon scriptable object and create the weapon action. And you can click on create, find a folder in the asset folder, and this will create the weapon prefab pre-configured with a damage collider that covers the weapon, which you can tweak to your how you prefer it. You get the weapon scriptable object with some basic information filled in, and you get all the attack action, which you can use or not use. But basically now you have this weapon, which as you can see has its own prefab, which we can add to the resource manager, add to the character, we need to say why is it that it's a weapon. And then we can equip it. As you can see, it's attached to the bone in a weird way, but it's perfectly usable, except that the animations are not set for the attack action. That's why you see that glitch when I press the mouse button. But we can, for example, go into axe attack 1 and say you use one hand attack 1, no overriding on the animation. And if I now I can attack, and I could of course bring in some animation specific for axe attacks and use an axe attack animation. In the next tutorial we will look at how to correctly position this weapon in the hand.